Welcome to our explainer. Today we're going to look at a symbol you see everywhere, the cross. But we're going to look at it to the lens of theologian F.T. Wright. And he asked this really challenging question. What if the cross isn't actually about punishment? What if it's something else entirely? A revelation of who God really is.
And that really gets us right to the heart of the paradox, doesn't it? I mean, let's be real. The cross was a gruesome tool for public execution. It was state-sponsored terror. So, how in the world can that, an instrument of death, be the ultimate symbol of a God who is all about life and love? This is the exact tension that F.T. Wright just dives right into.
And what's so interesting about Wright's approach is how he just completely flips the script on this. You know, we usually treat the cross like it's this mystery we have to explain. But Wright says no, you've got it backwards. The cross isn't the thing that needs explaining. The cross is the explanation. It's like a giant floodlight that once you turn it on, makes everything else, especially who God is, suddenly makes sense.
Okay, so to really get a handle on this revelation, we first have to tackle a really common idea, a misconception, as Wright calls it, about what was actually going on that day at Calvary.
And you've probably heard this version before. It's the idea that, our sin created this massive debt, and a just and maybe kind of angry God needed that debt to be paid. So the thinking goes, God took all that punishment and poured it out on Jesus instead of us. Jesus basically steps in and takes the hit.
But this is where Wright really pushes back. He asks us to stop and think. If God's justice looks like that, if it needs a violent payment that he himself inflicts on his own son, what does that actually say about him? Does that sound like a loving father, or does it sound more like some kind of cosmic executioner who has to be appeased?
Well, for F.T. Wright, the answer couldn't be clearer. He says the whole point of the cross was to destroy that image of God forever. It wasn't God finally acting like an executioner. It was God proving once and for all that he is nothing like an executioner. And the logic here is really important. Think about it. The so-called kingdom of darkness, or evil, or whatever you want to call it, it runs on force, right? Coercion, power, domination. Wright's point is, if God resorts to those same tactics, using his power to kill to get what he wants, then how is he any different? He'd be playing by the same rules he's supposed to be defeating. But the cross shows something totally different. It shows a God who dies to save, not one who kills to be in charge.
And this leads us straight to the absolute core of Wright's whole idea. It involves a pretty radical rethink of a very loaded term, the wrath of God.
So, here's the million-dollar question, right? If God the Father wasn't actively punishing Jesus on the cross, then what on earth do we do with all that biblical language about wrath? What was really going on in that darkness?
And here's Wright's game-changing answer. He argues that God's wrath isn't what we think. It's not this active, angry, lashing out. Instead, it's a passive, almost sorrowful thing. It's God saying, you've chosen to be separate from me, and I will honor that choice. It's him withdrawing his life-giving presence and just letting the consequences of that choice play out. So the crucial distinction is this. The Father didn't slay the Son. He just withdrew. He stepped back. And in that moment, Jesus experienced the full, horrifying consequence of sin, which is total separation from the very source of life itself.
So if you're asking what killed Jesus, Wright's answer isn't God, it was sin itself. Think of sin as this anti-life force. When God, the source of all life, withdrew his presence, that destructive force of all the world's pain and rebellion, that crushing weight, was simply allowed to do what it does. And what it does is kill. The outcome was death.
Okay, to make this whole concept even sharper, Wright sets up a powerful contrast. He talks about two different crosses which really stand for two completely opposite ways of operating in the world.
So on one side, you have the cross of Christ. Its principles are self-sacrifice, surrender, love, and freedom. But then, on the other side, he points to a counterfeit cross, the ancient symbol of Tammuz. And this one represents the world's way of doing things, force, coercion, and control.
And this really gets to the bottom line. For Wright, the cross is God's ultimate statement about power. It's his final word. He's saying that any God who uses threats and violence to make people obey, well, that's not him. That's a pagan God. The real God, the one we see in Jesus, is a God who would rather suffer and die himself than ever force anyone to love him.
Okay, so that's some pretty deep theology, right? But what's the so what? Why does any of this matter for us?
today? Well, it turns out seeing the cross this way changes pretty much everything. Let's look at the impact.
First, and maybe most importantly, it means an end to fear.
I mean, just think about that for a second. If the clearest picture we have of God is Jesus on the cross, arms open, taking in all the world's violence instead of dishing it out, then that whole picture of an angry, vengeful God just melts away. Wright says the cross gets rid of that old primal fear and replaces it with a sense of wonder, of awe, and a love that would go that far.
The second huge shift has to do with how we define one of God's most fundamental characteristics, his justice.
See, we tend to think of justice as payback, right? An eye for an eye. But Wright says the cross shows us a totally different kind of divine justice. It's not about God getting revenge. It's about God making things right. And part of that, incredibly, is honoring the freedom he gave his creation, even when we use that freedom to walk away from him and destroy ourselves. And finally, this isn't just an idea to think about. It's not just a theological concept. It actually becomes a roadmap for a whole new way to live.
And that's really the point, isn't it? The cross stops being just some historical event you read about. The way of the cross becomes a pattern for our own lives. It's a call to live that same kind of self-giving love and to flat out refuse to use force and control to get what we want from other people.
Now, let's be honest. This is not an easy way to live. There's a reason the Bible calls it foolishness. Everything about our survival instinct screams at us to protect ourselves, to win, to dominate. This idea of finding life by giving it away, of winning by surrendering, it cuts against the grain of everything we naturally think and feel. Which leaves us with this one last, really challenging question to chew on. Our world pretty much defines strength as the power to dominate, right? The power to control and compel others. But what if the cross turns that idea completely on its head? What if it reveals a different and ultimately a much greater strength? What if true strength isn't the power to compel, but the power to endure?